Folks, welcome to the first episode. Welcome to the first episode of the. Wow, I forgot the name. Yeah. All right, here we go. Folks, welcome to the first ever Mind Your Miles podcast. My name is Nick Hilton. I'm here with my two compadres, Dylan Bellis and Will Baldwin, and we are going to be here to talk to you about all things running, run coaching, coaching philosophies, and really whatever else comes to our mind during these kind of far-reaching conversations when we record here. So let's kind of go around first. Let's just introduce ourselves, talk about our backgrounds a little bit, and let's talk about the podcast. I'm going to kick it over to Dylan to get us started.
Yeah. My name is Dylan Bellis. So I'm originally from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I went to school at University of Greensboro. I ran there from 2011 until 2016. Since then, I've qualified for 2 Olympic trials marathons, and I have worked with over 1,000 athletes over the course of my own coaching career. I started working with an older elderly program called HOPE, Helping Older People Exercise. And then later I started working with a company called Runners Connect, where we worked with thousands of people on a given year, just developing and writing training plans and helping them get to the places they want to be. And I was able to meet a lot of really interesting people and work with some individuals on a one-to-one coaching basis from there as well. Stemming off of that, I ended up creating my own coaching business to where I'm here today. Very similar to Nick and Will. We both all work through the V.O2 platform, and I'm currently working with around 60 athletes at this point in time.
Mr. Baldwin, why don't you take that from here? Tell us about your background and what you got going on these days.
Yeah. My name's Will Baldwin. I'm from Southern Oklahoma, Tishomingo to be exact. I didn't run that much growing up. I played basketball and then ran later in college at East Central University in Ada, Oklahoma, D2. And then right after running in college, I started coaching as well. I stayed on and coached 1 year Division II as an assistant there. And then like Dylan and Nick, I've been working with individual clients since then. So since 2017, 2018. Just helping people run, get faster, all that stuff. And like Dylan and Nick, still run and compete a lot and in that world. And yeah.
All right, well, I'll pick up that mantle. My name's Nick Hilton. I have been running pretty much my entire life since junior high. Started when I was about 11 years old. I played sports prior to that, played baseball, really was my main sport. I was never very good at baseball. And then once I figured out that I was good at running, we kind of just ran with that to excuse the pun for there. And then, I ran cross country, track and field all throughout middle school, high school. I ran collegiately, Division II at Lock Haven University of Pennsylvania. And then I pursued a competitive career, moved from Pennsylvania out to Flagstaff, Arizona to be competitive, qualified for 2 Olympic marathon trials, and then gradually kind of moved into the coaching side of things. So I've been coaching really in some form since 2011. Obviously, I do a lot of the same kind of online coaching that Will and Dylan do, working with about 25 athletes currently, a lot of 35 to 55-year-old men training for Boston, and then a bunch of others in between there. So, first-time marathoners to more experienced sub-elite athletes and kind of everything in between. Right now, I'm still in Arizona. I'm based out of Phoenix. I work for Hoka as an account executive, sales rep, so I'm still kind of in the footwear game after coming from a long stretch in run specialty. So now that we're introduced and you have an idea of our backgrounds, kind of want to talk a little bit about, what this podcast is, what we hope to talk about, and kind of the genesis of it. And I'll lead us in here. I remember very specifically us 3 doing a long run on Waterline Road. This is probably like 2020, 2021, somewhere in there. Correct me if I'm wrong, maybe a little bit earlier. And we really just argued about training for about 2.5 hours, particularly around the subjects of longer aerobic steady states versus really long 40 by minute on, minute off fartleks, and having kind of in-depth conversations about running. And that was the first time that any of us had mentioned turning that into a podcast. And we've had extensions of those conversations really in the 3 or 4 years since that initial conversation. But to me, that's kind of where this whole stemmed, and that's kind of what we want this to be. And someone else can jump in and kind of talk about, their thoughts on the matter. But that's my first memory of us, having these conversations.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I think about what I want to listen to in a podcast, I try to find places that aren't going to kind of fall into the cookie cutter type of training. I find that a lot of people answer questions or approach talking about training in very abstract ways. And I would like to get to the point to where we talk more directly and actionable, because we as coaches and we as runners, we spend a lot of time trying to learn and trying to apply those things that we're trying to learn. And we find it, or at least I find it, increasingly hard to find information that is applicable and not just kind of skimming the surface. So I would like to at least take this podcast to the point to where we can provide actionable advice to people, but also just, provide entertainment and also give our own input and advice and insight on what's going on in our world of running and coaching.
Yeah, like I hate that too when you're listening to something and it's like very abstract and you're like, well, what did you do exactly? What was that workout, or what was your mileage, or it's like, not so you can copy, but just to get a better idea of that. Which I think that long run's really funny, because we were kind of arguing, like, I don't know. I feel like I've waffled on that topic back and forth, and but I've never been and everyone knows this about me, I've never been like a long, steady, slow tempo guy. Like, I don't really enjoy those things, but it's all I've done the last 8 months.
Oh, it's funny because
most of this year.
I've also waffled on that, and I tend to, when it comes to prescribing what I prescribe athletes, and even what I prescribe to myself when I'm still training a little bit at this point, I tend to lean more towards the longer fartlinks of the broken up steady states versus the 14, 15, 16 mile studies of yours. So, and I think that's part of the conversation too, is that there's an evolution to these things, like even outside of just what happens in the kind of coaching and running world at large, as more research is published and we have a better understanding of physiology, how we individually approach things based on experiences, coaches we've worked with, based on different times in our lives. Maybe, for myself, me being 35-year-old broken me versus me being 25-year-old indestructible me, there's a big difference. And my coaching philosophy and the way I think about training changes because of that. I think it makes me a better coach. And I think all of us can probably attest to some degree that with age and becomes experience, comes being able to convey that experience to our athletes a little bit better. So there's an evolution there, which I think is a fun part of the conversation, because, if we do this for a year, we can look back on conversations we had now or a month from now, and we'll probably have different feelings on some of those topics in a year from now. So I think that's also going to be a fun part of what this podcast can be and what these conversations are going to be like.
Yeah, I think that makes me think a lot about coaching philosophies, and how personally I don't love that when athletes come to me and they ask, "Hey, what is your coaching philosophy?" It's one of the questions that I hate the most, because it just feels like you're just being boxed in. And I think we, over the course of our lifetime in this sport, can tell you that we've done just about everything. We've had several different coaches between all of us. We've experienced several different programs. We've experimented with our own training. We've prescribed different training. And I think that from a philosophical point of view, I think it's really important to keep an open mind to things and to adapt, to essentially to always be learning, to apply what we're learning, and then just to refine that over time.
It's funny. I just I've been writing I don't know if a blog post or just something for myself about trying to write down my training philosophy. And I feel like I did an okay job of it, but it is hard, because there's your training philosophy, and then there's I think there's some people we know who have too defined of a training philosophy, and everyone that comes in is getting that, you're doing hills on Tuesday and you're doing this kind of long run. And so you don't want to be that narrowed down.
Right.
Yeah.
There's principles versus set in stone ways. This is it's my way or the highway. You either do what I'm asking you to do and you turn out to be amazing, which is what you see in a lot of college programs, right? You just do the same thing And you get people who are like, wow, like they were, 920, 3,200 meter guys in high school. Now they're national champions. And versus the other guys who come in who were really good in high school, and then you don't
I
even
love that
see
you're
them
trying to
run
make
again.
920 sound slow.
Well, these days, right? I will say, and we can preface this and let everyone know that Nick Hilton was a lot faster than Will and I were in high school. And Nick, did you run 920 in high school?
930.
I ran 928 in high school, but I did run 413 in the mile, so I was a better miler than I was.
I
a
will say the
2 mile.
Northeast is so different. I've met so many people who I'm like, you would have been Jesus Christ where I'm from, and they were just like a regular dude.
Yeah, I was 8th at my state meet my senior year when I ran 413. And actually, there've been a lot of those guys ahead of me. There's been at least 3 from that class who went on to hit OTQs or run well collegiately. So there was a lot of talent in the state at that point in time. But I think it's interesting because we all have very different backgrounds when it comes to either accomplishments in high school or college. Will having 0 of them up until he was like a senior, up until a senior in college. But we didn't really end up all that far away from each other when it comes to accomplishments outside of college, whether it's marathon results or results in bigger races. So there is something interesting there in the development arc. That adds to, I think, all of our different experiences when it comes to coaching as well too.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that we all, like, I think Nick, you had a deeper experience with running than Will and I. However, I mean, I'm kind of in between that. Like, Will did other things in high school. Running wasn't as much of his emphasis, but yeah, like you said, we all ended up roughly in the same place, which is pretty cool. It just kind of shows you can, where you can start from, and ultimately where you can end up being, which is what we end up seeing a lot with the people that we're coaching as well. We get a lot of people who didn't have an athletic background, or at least didn't have an athletic background in the sense that they weren't running in middle school, they weren't running in high school, and they started running later in life.
I have a good question about that. So often people, like when we're doing our intro call, they're like, I've run 4 hours. I want to qualify for Boston. Do you think that's possible? And I'm always like, yeah. And sometimes they're like, you really think I can shave an hour? And it like, not trying to sound like a salesman, but I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's not that crazy. But I mean, obviously, like knowing each person's situation. But how do you guys feel about that? Do you ever? I mean, I'm never like you're gonna be a 315 guy or something. But like, there's some people you're hearing their backgrounds. Like, yeah, that's not like what you were doing wasn't mind blowing. There's tons of room for growth. Like, yeah, I think you could. And I've done it before. I mean, I took a dude this last year who'd run 340 and he ran 250 in 10 months. Like that's not insanely common, but it's not rare.
Yeah, I always try to be cautiously optimistic. I don't like to give athletes unreal expectations of what I think they can accomplish, but especially when you get one who's particularly raw, who just, has had some results but with very little background, very little structure. I'm like, yeah, you can go a lot farther than what you can run a lot faster than what you think you can run. But I think it's rare. I think it's rare for us, for guys in our position, and it does happen that you have an athlete who's coming to you who's been running for 18 years with tons of structure, has been doing 80-mile weeks. Like, we rarely have those kinds of conversations. It's just like those just aren't the people who are typically coming to our services. So I think we're often encountering runners who have the ability to accomplish way more than what they maybe originally thought.
Yeah, I think with the athletes that I coach, just with a lot of my athletes being referrals from current athletes, I don't tend to get a lot of new runners. So I get most of the people that I am working with have been running for quite some time. And while the trajectory of their training, it can potentially go pretty far. Almost everyone I talk to, I never, there's not a single person I've met that like, oh yeah, you've hit your limit. I haven't seen that, but I haven't had the case with working with people individually. I definitely have when I work with Runners Connect, when you have a lot of newer runners, of course. But yeah, actually, most of the people that I work with are more so searching for like 5 or 10 minutes versus 30 minutes or an hour.
That's crazy. We have such a different base. I mean, I have some of those people, but probably like at least, I don't know, 40, 50% are like fresher. Like like, you know, I started running during COVID, or, you know, some, like, I still get people that have never done a structured workout, or like, yeah, I have a lot more. I mean, I have some of those people, you know, who are like 310 guys that want to get down or something like that, or 250 guys want to be 230 guys. But yeah, I have a lot more newer folks, which I like. I feel really, I feel really confident in that world, which is kind of weird. I never would have thought that. Like, I had this 40-year-old woman the other day, like, do you coach people like me? And I was like, lady, I don't know why, but I do.
That reminds me, like, do you guys feel like you guys feel like out of all the athletes you have a niche? Is there a certain type of people, a person that you work with? I definitely have one of mine. I'd like to hear you guys first, and then I'll explain kind of the people.
Absolutely. I think I mentioned it in my intro to some degree. It's 35 to 50-year-old guys qualifying for Boston. That really is, I would say that makes up for 85% of my clients is that base. And that might be, I mean, that could be potentially a result of the platform we coach on. So VDOT, the people who are coming to VDOT are the people who maybe live in that world. But that is a really the vast majority of the athletes that I end up working with and have worked with at least over the past 8 years.
Mine isn't super that specific, but it is not intentionally in any way, but it is often newer folks. And because I work with Sundog, the trail coaching organization with Ian Torrance, I get a lot of people who are trail curious, or kind of like myself, have bounced back in the world. And
you're saying you go both ways, Will? You're a little,
right.
Yeah.
Which has been really helpful, because there's like cool things from both sides, or people who just want to try that.
It's fun to experiment a little bit. I agree. Yeah, it's enjoyable.
Gosh, Nick, Jesus. But yeah, and newer people, which is never was my intention, never was my target, but I've weirdly become good at like really learning how to explain things like you've never run before, you know, like I think that's made me a better coach, because sometimes we assume, especially when you get those like guys who are in that Boston realm, you assume they know how to run a workout. You assume they know how to run an easy day, where I take every person with a little bit of like, let's start from ground zero. And then maybe they'll learn, even if they do know everything, maybe they'll learn something a little bit along the way, which I think that's where we're most valuable. Like, I think people, there's a lot of little things that we know that we do better than the average person, that we can, like how we would do a workout versus watching a regular person, you know? And those are the things I think we can really give to people. But anyways, what's yours, Dylan?
So 75% of the athletes that I coach live in New York City, which I find is really interesting. A lot of them know each other, but a lot of them don't too. So there's a good handful of them who kind of have met each other, though maybe don't like know each other too formally, but it's been just like kind of referrals, like friends, family, that type of deal. And then I'm always surprised when I'll get an inquiry from someone who lives in Brooklyn. I get a lot of those. I'm like, oh, did you meet me, you know, because of so and so? They're like, no, I just found you on VDOT. So it's really interesting to me. I get a lot of 75% of my people are from New York City, and I would say I'm pretty split, about 50% male versus female. I don't think I don't get one versus the other, but my categorization of things would be most of my athletes are busy. I guess you imagine living in New York City, like they're trying to navigate their own life. They need the structure. They need the accountability. They want to have someone that they can relay questions off of, but really just to make it easy for themselves. These people are very driven. They're very successful in the things that they do with their jobs, their occupations. They're professionals at what they do. And these are the kind of people who wake up super early. They get their runs done. A lot of them run with other people, and most of them are, I'd say 95% are also marathon runners. So yeah, I'd say the majority of my people, I would categorize them as like hardworking, busy professionals who need the accountability, the structure, and then someone who shares the same passion as them, because these are the same people who, this is their community, right? They're their coworkers. They don't run, you know, a lot of their families also don't run. This is their thing. And so it's really cool to share that with them.
So kind of, I was gonna say piggybacking off of that, but I'll get
No
yelled
podcast
at
term.
by no podcast terminology here. I'm kind of curious. We're talking about the types of athletes. I want to pivot and talk about influences. I'm going to use some more podcast terminology there, really get Will triggered as we move into this. But how did you develop, the way you work with athletes? Like, what coaches have you pulled from? What programs have you pulled from? What experiences have you had individually in your past that allowed you or that shaped you to be kind of the coach that you are right now?
Do you want me
It's a
to
big
let me?
question.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
So like, I was just saying that's a big question. I think a lot of us
Let's distill it. Let's just kind of go broad, kind of broad strokes. How did you end up coaching the way you coach?
I would say it's still an evolution. I'm still trying to learn from interesting people in the sport, whether that's athletes or coaches themselves. I think, at least looking back, I remember one of the first people that I really looked up to was Brad Hudson. And so Brad Hudson he's got his own book. I've got it over here somewhere.
I have it autographed.
Yeah, I got one of those too. The black book. I actually have one of his older books as well. I think he did it with Matt Fitzgerald. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it was one of the first running books that I read. And I felt like he was one of those people who has invested himself fully into the sport. And I as someone who athletically wants to get the most out of myself, and the same thing with my coaching and take it very seriously. Like I want to get the most out of it. Like it's good to go to people who also, that's their life. So you've got people like Brad Hudson, there's the Steve Magnuses of the world. There's Mike Smith, who's really good. Renato Canova. There's a lot of names I think that we can drop, but I think historically there's so many different people who provide a lot of insight, but I think what I like to do is just take bits and pieces from different people and try to apply that. And at least for me, it's not necessarily the philosophy, but I'm just trying to get an understanding of not just the specific workout that they're doing, I want to know why they're doing it, and ultimately how that's helping us, when we should apply it. And that's another thing that really irritates me, is that a lot of coaches, a lot of people will put a lot of information out there, like, do this workout. This is the best workout for this. But there's never actually this is how you do it. This is when you do it. And this is how to do it. And that really bothers me. And I feel like Brad Hudson really did a really good job at that. So that's just one. I feel like I could talk all day about this, and, I don't want to take everyone's air.
Well, there's so much on. I feel like if you're ever on Twitter for more than, I don't know, and running Twitter specifically for more than like an hour, you're gonna see like so many of these different workouts. Like, oh, do this workout when you're getting ready for a 5K, and it's like, well, okay, why? It's super annoying. We can name
We need to
names.
have
I'm
a
not
whole
gonna
episode of just going through that. Like when I was sending you guys the walking thing, you could talk for, and I feel like that'd be so helpful to people, because there are people who have huge platforms who say the dumbest things in the world on Twitter. Like, you shouldn't run, you should walk.
Yeah, that's bad.
Yeah.
Just without the proper context behind it.
Well, that's the thing. Like all of these, and maybe that's a larger Twitter issue, but there never is context. It's like, do this workout, but what if you only run 20 miles a week? Like, why you're not going to do a workout that's 10 miles of work, like for a 5K or for a 10K? That doesn't make any sense. So that's the big thing, is everything can have context. Walking as a part of your running can be important for some runners, but you got to have the proper context. That's someone who has never really run before could really benefit from incorporating that style of training or whatever. So there's there's places for that kind of stuff, but when you don't provide context, that's where, and I'm sure you've all had this conversation with athletes, because I have, where they're coming to you with these popular styles of training that they're finding, that they're Googling, or that they see in a popular publication or a magazine or on social media. And you have to zone two training, double thresholds right now is just is hot in the streets. So like, yeah, having those conversations and talking about talking about that can get frustrating because everyone's just spewing this stuff into the universe without context, and so people just kind of take it and run with it. And I don't blame the athletes for that. They're taking what they see from people who consider themselves experts, but it still is frustrating.
Yeah.
Um,
One of my biggest pet peeves is when you get a running book and you're just trying to, there's maybe a lot of really good information in there. You take some of it, you write it down, maybe you save it for later. Really, a lot of the books I feel like provide a lot of context of specific types of training. But then you go and you look at how it's applied, and they show like training plans in the back of the book, and it makes zero sense. They just, here's 16 weeks of training, no explanation, no rationale, and you're just like, oh, well, this kind of stinks because you just gave me all this wonderful information and you explained it, and then you put these, you put this workout in the back of the book that's applicable for like what, 5% of people, maybe. Yeah, that's a big pet peeve of mine when it comes to.
They're bad,
learning.
but they're also the reason we have jobs.
That's true.
I need to track this, but I would love to know how many people come from me from like they tried to do a training plan and for whatever reason something stopped working for them. Weirdly on VDOT.
Yeah. I've gotten a few people from Higdon, a few people from
Higdon, Fitz.
Yeah.
I get a lot of Higdon. I think that's just because if you Google free marathon training plan, that's what comes up. But Higdon, Fitz, and I get a ton.
Hanson's.
I've never had a Hanson, I don't think, but I get a ton off of the VDOT actual ones, and because then I can see them, and I'm not a fan, but
I do get some from there as well too. People who. And VDOT, I'll give them some credit here, not just because I'm on their platform, because I do think they do a good job in general. Like if you open up some of the individual workouts, like there's good explanations on how to do certain things and how to do strides and workouts and things of that nature. But I think it's I personally hate selling training plans. I put them up there. Some people want training plans. That's fine. I just think that unless you really kind of know what you're doing and know how to execute, like I can leave all the notes in the world on a workout, but being coached one-on-one is just going to be way more effective for the athlete and for myself. Like just putting out a training plan.
Even when you know what to do and execute, you want to coach, Yeah. LeBron has 8 different coaches. He's got a personal trainer. He's got a strength guy. He's got a pliability guy. He has tennis. It's the smartest people we know. Every good runner has a coach, It's like, because it's not just execution, or it's not just there's so many other
it's the art of it. It's not just coaching. Isn't just science. If it was just science, then training plans would be great. Then you could execute everything based on numbers, but there's more to it beyond just that. There's conversations to be had with athletes, manipulating the workouts, going by how they're feeling, what they have going on in their jobs, their lives, their kids. And I think for us and coaches in our position, because we work with professionals and adults and people who have families, like that's what we do. We work around their individual situations. Oh, hey, I have to travel for work this week. What should I do for my workouts? Or, hey, my kid got sick and I had to miss these runs. What can I do? What do I do now? And so many times clients will be like, well, should I just add that mileage into to the rest of my week so I can get my weekly mileage? Or, hey, can I just do these 2 workouts back to back or whatever in order to kind of hit what they want to hit? And you have to go through the conversation with them that that's not the best idea. And if they were just doing a training plan, they might run into all these kind of issues because life happens. And so that's why it's good to have people like us here to,
out of tons of love and respect, their ideas are always so wild. You're like, man, out of all the ways you could have altered this, that's about the 19th thing I think I would have come up with.
And
but what? Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and if we were to go into their jobs and make suggestions about how to alter their week, it would be the same thing. So it's not it's not saying that they're dumb people or whatever. It's just that we're coming from different backgrounds, like stepping into different people's shoes. So
that's what you're paying for. You're paying for someone's in 2 seconds, we know the right answer. Whereas they 90% of the time will probably do something less than ideal. And so that's what you're getting. You're getting someone you can send a text and you will get a very well thought out, intelligent response of how to adjust.
And I think the reason why we're able to apply this advice is because we've also made the same mistakes, in our own training. So it's easy to be empathetic when you have made the same mistakes, probably some of us several times. And I think most good runners and coaches have done everything wrong. And so when you see someone doing something that you don't agree with, or something that seems very outlandish, it's very easy for us to relate to that, because we've also made that mistake and we've also had to face the repercussions of it.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like we're like picking on other runners or getting onto them, but I think at the base of it, we just know, like, nah, I've done that before. Like, that's probably not.
We're our
not the move.
own personal guinea pigs in that regard. I mean, all the stupid crap I've done in my training to myself, it helps inform, how to coach other athletes.
You got to
Nick,
be
are you
really
gonna?
patient too. You got to be really patient, because Will, like you were saying, like, it's really easy for us to make assumptions and to assume that everyone knows what to do, they know how to do it, and they're going to do it. They're thinking the same way that we're thinking. But for me, at least, I've always had to tell myself to just be patient and to just put myself in their shoes, like you all were saying, because it's to them, to some athletes, it seems like the right thing. And we have to kind of take a step back and be like, oh yeah, that's right, I also made that mistake one point in time. Like, I need to answer this or help provide rationale to this in a very clear but kind way, because when you're working with a coach, especially someone who's new, like we're just talking prior to this podcast about going into cycling shops as runners and feeling like we have no clue what's going on, and how easy it is to just walk in, walk out, and just feel so turned off by the sport, because this seems like there's a barrier for entry. And I feel like as a coach and you're working with runners, there also feels like there can be a barrier there, because someone's new and doesn't know what to do, and you got to be kind of sensitive sometimes, and just making sure that you're providing constructive information and guidance, but not doing it in a brash or harsh way that drives them away from you or from the sport in general.
100%.
Nick,
are you going to tell us your philosophy background, how you became a coach, how you think about coaching?
Well, I think about my initial exposure to really thinking about training really came in college. My college coach, shout out Aaron Russell, Lock Haven University, was strength based, at least when I was there. So tons of volume, tons of mileage, lots of strength based work, very much like Lydiard influenced. And so that was really the first time that I started thinking about training, and then using that in my own day-to-day stuff. And then when I moved out to Flagstaff, I worked with a couple different coaches. Trina Painter, she was kind of out of the Macmillan School of Coaching, and worked with Ben from NAZ Elite for a little bit, and worked with Vince from Run Flag for a little bit, so who was Daniel's base. So really having exposed myself to a really wide variety of other coaches kind of informs where I'm at now. And I pick and choose from a lot of those different styles. But I would say that for the bulk of my athletes, I haven't gotten too far away from my roots, and I tend to believe that a strength-based philosophy is the best way to approach stuff, particularly with the marathon. And that's not to say that I mix in tons of speed and tons of fast work. I pull from Daniels, and we do reps and reps and reps and reps and reps all the time. But really, everything I've always done pulls from those kind of initial exposures into Lydiard and a more of a strength-based philosophy. So that's kind of where I come from, and I pull from other places outside of that. And that's how I trained. That's how I just trained for the vast majority of my career as well too. So I think I'm heavily influenced by that. Whereas if I maybe, if I had come up at a different time or worked with different coaches, it probably would have changed that significantly if we would have focused on different things. But that's always how I've approached things, and in that regard.
I think that Will and I could both relate with that as well. I think we have both seen considerable progress when it came to just running more, doing a lot more strength work. I mean, we were known for just doing a bunch of threshold based sessions and just doing that on in and on in on in. And that was a really easy way for us to get better. At least growing up, it was just the more we ran, the faster we were able to become. So it's really easy to put ourselves into that strength based mindset. And then, just making sure that you're maintaining speed. But I think that goes to say that most of running, most of training, no matter almost all distances, the strength component of it is very important. And is the primary part of things. But even with that, you've got to be able to maintain everything along that spectrum, which is kind of where my philosophy on things goes. I want to be able to put mileage on people to make sure that we're doing plenty of threshold work, that we're doing those longer sustained, tempo runs. And I'm not talking about like 15, 16 mile long runs. And like, in this case, I'm thinking maybe like 4 to 8 miles worth. But also making sure that I also understand the population that I'm working with as well. Cause you got to think that sometimes, that's going to get people most of the way. But we're also talking about people who haven't had the same experiences as us and didn't run middle school, high school, college athletics. And so the understanding of what it feels like to push themselves and to actually work through those ranges of motion for mile reps, or let's just say 5K pace reps, are a bit more foreign than it is to go and run steady runs or marathon pace, which for a lot of people ends up being close to easy runs sometimes. So I think that while we would agree that, hey, the strength part of things is what makes a lot of people successful, that's why we know runners and have seen experience and run with those individuals who are running 100, 120, 140, 150 miles per week. But then you got to kind of dilute that down to when you're working with people who run 25 or 30 miles a week and think yourself, what's going to get the biggest benefit for the time that they have? And for at least in my experience, sometimes that's not doing a copious amount of threshold work, but instead it's trying to integrate faster turnover economy type of sessions, power producing sessions that help them improve their fitness in a different way, which still does in turn have an effect on your thresholds and ability to sustain paces and everything.
Well, I think also strength is a relative term, just like every term in coaching and running is. So strength to someone who is, run 20 miles a week is different from someone who runs 120 miles a week. Like the type of strength work it's scaled and is relative to the individual. So, I don't believe that everyone needs to do high volume or high mileage. I've actually kind of come down from that, from where I used to be as an athlete and a coach, that I feel like a more tailored approach, less volume, more intensity, is going to be a better fit for more athletes. That's where I've grown personally, is going from that type of mindset to where I really was as an athlete to where I am as a coach now, of changing from being a strength and mileage to more of a blended approach and doing what's best for the athlete. So that's been a point of personal growth, crediting some conversations that the three of us have had, kind of talking through that stuff and getting ideas from you, as well as reading and having a better understanding of training philosophy in general.
It's a huge pet peeve of mine when people like mischaracterize workouts like strength or speed. Like if you do 30 by 200 off either 1 or 200 float, like there's oftentimes I've done like big 200 sets where I'm averaging like 550 pace, but half of that is 4-minute, like, and you can test it, lactate, aerobic, like it is a very much aerobic session at that point. You're talking 5 miles of 550 where, it's like, so yeah, not seeing where like speed is, where they cross over. That's actually when I was writing about my training philosophy, I've really pivoted hard from where I think things are currently, especially in the lactate era, that I think we're heading down a road of overhyping up running that is slower than what we're asking in competition. So like fit athletes who do tons and tons of these lactate sessions, who are hoping to go run 440 pace, but they're doing all their threshold at 530 or 520 so they can stay in a lactate zone. Like there's a point as an athlete where you don't feel confident on the line. The same where athletes are nervous when they haven't run a 20 miler before a marathon. Like there's a point where you're neuromuscularly, you're not ready, and mentally you're not ready if you haven't done work at or faster than competition speed. And so I think not only is it great physiologically, but also mentally, you have to like think of that when you are, if you are getting so strength heavy. And so, yes, those things are so great and especially in the base phase and especially for aerobic development, but like we're trying to run fast and compete. And I think sometimes if you just read the internet, you think like, if I just run so much at a 120 heart rate and I'm so low lactate, I'll just hop out and run so fast. And that is just not, I mean, I've run a million 110-mile weeks at altitude. And if you don't do speed, you will be slow. I don't know what to tell you. Like, there's no such thing as being so efficient and so much zone 2 that somehow your rep pace and your 5K just magically shows up for you. It's just not how it works.
So then what happens when you get people who do the opposite of that? So I get
It's
a lot
also
of that.
bad. It's also bad.
So you also get people who are like, all I want to do is run race pace. Like
Yes.
they're like, I like to ask, I send out like notes, VDOT notes to some of my athletes. And I just kind of like to ask them like, what do they feel like they need more or less of? I try to have that conversation with people all the time because ultimately you're out there and you know your body and everyone has a feeling of like, if I did this a little bit more, I think I would be better.
100%.
And I've had to be very careful with asking this question because it almost always ends up being the same thing. So I need to do more miles at X pace.
Yeah. And that's that mental thing. Like, I want to feel what it's like to run 3 miles at that. And sometimes you give that, but that's, the same as like running a 20 miler for a marathon. There's not like, there isn't some golden ticket. Like, you do the 20, now you get to run the marathon. Or if you didn't do it, we don't know if you're going to finish or not. Good luck.
Yeah.
That's a topic for a whole podcast, I think, is the 20-mile run before the marathon.
That is just one of the biggest. You just do it because they want it. But I've had so many athletes that have like, yeah, I've run 6 marathons. Furthest I've ever run in a training run is like 11 miles. It's like people run marathons all the time off of awful no training. There isn't. Not that that's ideal, but it's not or people say that about getting a 23. They're like, well, this way I won't, it won't hurt as bad that last 6. Like, brother, you can do everything in the world. You can jog 26 miles and the last 6 hurt. Like, we can't protect you from that. The last bit of a marathon sucks no matter what you do. Just physiologically. It's where we all just break down. Like,
I've had people, unfortunately, who will go way off script in like the final 4 to 6 weeks of the marathon and to just try to reaffirm themselves and their training, and they'll go around 26 or 27 miles, just to prove to themselves that they can run a marathon or race a marathon. And I've had people do that in training, and it's just, or the same thing where I might give like a 3-mile threshold tempo and they'll run it at 5K race pace so that they can try to prove to themselves that they can do it. And yeah, I mean, that's a big one, right? Is like trying to convince people, trying to help people understand that they don't have to spend significant time trying to prove themselves and to train to race and not to race your training. I'm a big believer, and I tried to preach on people having sustainable training and to do that over a long period of time. I read a quote, and I don't remember where I read it from. Maybe it was like James Clear or Tim Ferriss or something. And it said, it was something along the lines of like, we overestimate what we can do in a short period of time, and we underestimate what we can do in a long period of time. And I think that really goes along the lines of like, if you can create a sustainable training plan, then you can have consistency. And if you can have consistency, then you'll see progress. If you see progress, then you'll be happy with your training. And if you're happy with your training, then it helps you as a coach.
Dude, that's the big thing when you get an athlete and they're like, they sign up and they're like, their goal race is like 13 months away. You're like, because all those people like, I got this marathon in 12 weeks. Can you fix me? And you're like, I don't know, maybe like, but the people who give you a year, you're like, what I can do with somebody in a year is magic, or 2 years or something. Like, people who are ready to go on that journey with you.
Yeah, people who just want to have the long-term lens, like they understand that it is about that long-term consistency and growth, which there aren't a lot of those people out there. A lot of those people out there. It's most of my clients.
That person and they're like, my goal race is 11 months away. You're like, we're about to do some business, man.
That's two macro cycles. We can do a whole lot of ancillary work. Like that's the fun stuff. That's the great stuff to dig into.
Yeah.
A brief tangent from this, or stemming off of that. So when you have someone who says, I want to run a marathon in 11 months or 12 months, as you're saying, how do you all shape that training? Like, how do you make it so that it's, so that you keep them engaged? You're always working on something, that you're able to keep them healthy. You're able to sustain the training over that period of time. Like what different things do you all do to make that happen? I mean, I get those people too. So I'm just kind of curious what you think.
Dude, I'm all about your local 5K, 10Ks. If I mean, we were talking about this the other day, if I can get someone's 10K down, I'm more and more convinced that your 10K has a bigger correlation to your marathon than I think people maybe give it credit. Not like there's some silly formula, that you put this in and you get this out, but having that short speed block and getting those times down. So then, I mean, it's the same for everyone. We don't want to get into, and it's happened to me, like you have some goal and then you get into that threshold pace, or you get into that pace and you're like, this is too uncomfortable from a mechanical perspective, from an aerobic perspective. Like we want to, once we get to that specific last block where we're marathon focused, you want to be at that point, you'll be like, oh, this is kind of cruisy. I got to grind at the end, but like rhythm wise, it's not hard for me to run marathon pace anymore. And there's a lot of people, especially, I don't know, on all ends of the spectrum where you're starting to block and it's not comfortable yet. And so getting that speed down is generally the answer.
The bottom up approach, right? So you get fast first and then extend that in distance.
Well, and then if we get some PRs, 5K, 10Ks, we're getting some great community. We're so inspired because we're running faster, and it's so easy to translate that. And then you can be putting all those really smart things, like, some of the hill stuff that's really good early on, and some of those other things you want to work on that are going to help that marathon training later on. But getting some PRs along the way, nothing better.
Well, I think there's a huge mental component too, of not just like you've been doing the same strength volume aerobic work for 11 months, like
Going
marathon
marathon to
tempos.
marathon.
Yeah, like long runs like that could be a mental drag. So even just having like that block of 4 to 6 months where you're just focusing on short, fast stuff, or focusing on stuff that maybe haven't focused on in a long time, like it's just a mental refresher. And then they're feeling mentally so much better when they get to the marathon stuff. It feels easier because they've been running 5K, 10K work for the last like 4 months. Like I just think there's a huge mental component to that too. Not discounting the fact that they're probably PRing or running faster than they have in a long time at those shorter distances, and so they're already having all these positive feelings when they're going into the marathon block, which I think is super helpful.
Well, and it's the same thing every professional does. Like I remember when I first moved to Flag, I was running like with Diego Estrada one time, and like in college we didn't officially have a track team, but we would go to all these meets and we would just first meet 5K and we'd run like 6 5Ks all year. And you just 5K, 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 5K. And I was telling Diego that, and he was like, it's like, dude, I only raced like 8s and 15s until this point, like whatever I'm trying to qualify for, I will not run that race until, late in the season. And, I'll only do 15. So I'm really sure. And it's just kind of like such a tried and true, like when that relative speed is so much easier, then when you switch to that slower event, you're able to be a little more comfortable. And I was like, well, yeah, that makes a lot more sense than what I've been doing.
Well, I think like just to kind of further expand like the pro model, like pro marathoners they'll spend time doing speed work in their off season, and pro milers are going to spend time doing strength work in their off season. So it's a universal concept that outside of your primary racing season, you're working on something, a different skill, a skill you may be weaker in, or that you don't touch upon so frequently when you're in your primary racing season. So that's one of those concepts that you can scale from the pro level and scale that for everybody else, and it's going to be applicable all the way down the line.
Do you all have specific types of training, or maybe even specific workouts that, despite going in between, hey, if you're a marathoner, you're training for 5Ks, or if maybe you are more of a miler and you're training, maybe do something longer like a 10K or half marathon build, is there other staple sessions that you all still do throughout the year, no matter what the training cycle is?
Like regardless of event?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a few. I mean, a classic one. This is a classic Vince Sherry team run Flagstaff session is 3 to 4 by 3-2-1 on 90 seconds recovery. That's something I,
What
if
pace?
any of my athletes listen to this, they'll have done that workout more times than they probably would have cared to. But I just think it's a great like early season session or pull late season, add a set or two, change the paces. I just think it's a super malleable session that athletes get a lot out of.
Can you expand on like roughly what paces that would be and what the recovery from that is?
Sure. So the full session for most is 3 sets of 3 minute, 2 minute, 1 minute on 90 seconds recovery throughout. So you take 90 seconds after the 3, 90 after the 2, 90 after the 1. So that's between sets, you still get 90. And we kind of start it at a little bit of a
90 set rest.
90 set rest. Yeah.
Come on, coach.
We kind of started off at threshold or a touch faster than threshold. So I'll kind of adjust it to be, instead of a true threshold, maybe 5 seconds ish faster per mile. And then we go 2 minutes at like a 10K ish effort, and then the 1 minute at 5K effort. And then if they're feeling good, they can get spicy the last set on that minute and get closer to like a 5K to a rep effort. But that's more or less where I have them do it.
Nice. I try to sustain a lot of threshold work just throughout the year. Try to do that in as many forms as I possibly can. So I can do that in like shorter reps. So Will was kind of talking about those 200s. I like to do 200 or 400 meter reps where you have equal distance rest, but it's steady. So, so like, for example, like a 12 by 400 on, 400 off, which is not too dissimilar from like the alternating type of fartleks that we've all done here. But what I like to do is I'll make those 400 ons pretty fast and then make the 400 off relatively slow, marathon pace plus 45, 60 seconds or so. So it's not easy, but it's not hard. What this allows them to do is essentially run faster than, what your like actual 60-minute threshold pace would be, but it still would be within threshold range, if that makes sense in terms of the actual intensity. So you can still run faster than your threshold pace and still hit threshold. So I like to do that. Or sometimes I'll even do something along the lines of 12 by 400 with just 100 float. So I like to make it so that we're working on threshold in the short sense of things. So 200, 400 reps, but then I also just like to do the very simple, like 8 by half mile or 4 by mile, and just try to build on the threshold work from there. So depending on the level of the athlete, we might do pretty continuous amount of 3 or 4 by mile, or, for the higher level athletes, we'll probably even push that up to 6 or 7, maybe even 8 per mile throughout the year, just to make sure that we're maintaining that. And then one of the other things I really like to do is kind of breakdown. So it might be like 3 by mile, 3 by half mile, 3 by quarter mile, and 3 by 200 meters, each getting a little bit faster, just so that they're working through a wide range of paces, kind of similar to what Nick, it's actually very similar setup to what you were saying, Nick. But ultimately, when someone doesn't have a race for a long time, I just want to make sure that they don't get bored. Training is boring. And I think for people who are of our level, we can do the same things over and over and over and over again and not care. And it's like, yeah, this is what we're going to do. Like, we can do the same workout every single week and we'll get really good because of it. And I have a lot of athletes who understand that, and we might do repetitive workouts over and over again, and they have no issue with it. But I find that just to keep people engaged, to keep them fresh, and just to keep them mentally like on top of it for that long period of time, it's good to just mix it up and just give their body something different to work off of.
Dude, that's the funny thing you can see on the internet, when you can tell people are like Twitter coaches and not real coaches, because there are so many things you do like that maybe aren't like the perfect in a vacuum physiological week, but like, yeah, like in a base phase, if you're not like putting a lot of quality in, that's fine. But a lot of people, if there's not some type of like pace change or some, faster portion in that workout, people just get bored, and like, they're more likely to skip a run or cut it short, or like, so even including stuff that maybe is like easier, having more days with strides or things like that, just to like stay engaged, especially through those off-season patches, like, I don't know, like, especially like Lydiard, people are always funny, like, yeah, I'm just going to run 10 weeks and do this one thing and not do anything else, or like,
I hate it.
Yeah, people just don't function that way, like, I mean, Kat has a Peloton bike I've been riding, and it's like the same thing. Why it's so fun, because you're just always doing something, and like, it's a little bit too far the opposite. You're just throwing so much spaghetti at the wall, like all these intervals up, down, but it's so much more engaging than like, okay, we're in the base phase. We're going to run 70 minutes every day at zone 1. And that's like, that just doesn't work for people, man.
I think you have to have heavy periods of general training before you go into specific training. I think
for sure
the level of your specific
but how
training
you
is
do
highly
that
dependent.
general can be more fun.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. But yeah, I think you got to do, like, for example, you saying, hey, try to elevate someone's 10K before a marathon. Like, you got to do stuff that's going to help support everything before you get into that specific phase of training, because you can only do that type of training for so long before it starts to wear you down. So do you guys monitor intensity? Like when you're in the off season, we'll call it, like, do you guys try to scale back intensity? Do you monitoring intensity, or you're not really too worried about it? You're okay with just like pushing, like actually pushing for extended periods of time?
No, I'm pretty scaled back.
Yeah.
Because I want to be able to turn it on when we get there a little bit. So, I mean, like we was kind of saying, like some of those smaller things, but pretty scaled back.
Yeah, and if we're looking at a season being 16 weeks or so as a macro phase or one bigger phase, like that whole phase isn't going to be full intensity. Like there's going to be periods of off intensity, especially at the beginning of that, and then when you're rolling into the next phase, you'll have that in between series. It's kind of more recovery running, some lower intensity stuff as we build into it. So really, it's a percentage, maybe 50%, 65% ish or so of each build has like that really structured intensity. Otherwise, we're kind of dialing it down a little bit. I think it's hard. I think it's hard for a lot of athletes to maintain focus mentally and physically for the entirety of a full build. So I think just trying to shorten that and keeping it as fun as possible and is important. And that's a conversation I have with all my athletes. Like if they want a 20-week marathon build up, it's like, well, it's 20 weeks, but it's really probably 12 weeks or 8 to 12 weeks if you take out the taper of actual like really hard specific work. A lot of it is table setting and stuff that's a little bit more kind of base hits and easier stuff.
I think that's the biggest, in my opinion, I'm curious what you guys think, but like disconnect from us to regular people because of like all the marathon, like 12-week marathon plan, 16-week plan. I think people think of training for a marathon like that, where I don't think we do. Like obviously, like when we get closer, our last 8 weeks will be super specific, but like there's not like well, now I'm training for, like, we're always kind of training, we're always trying to be fit or fast. And then, well, I got this race come up, so I gotta, now my workouts are geared towards that. But I've never seen another runner where it's like, well, I'm in this marathon phase now. It's like, it's hard to break people. Like, when do we start training for the marathon? It's like, well, we are, like, like this workout is going to help you do that workout. But like,
you've been training for the last 2 years for this marathon.
Yeah, people want you to like put it on there. Now we're doing marathon stuff, or like, is this a marathon workout or a 5K work? It's like, it just doesn't. That's not how it works. Like
that's the fallacy of the online training programs, is that it convinces people that you're in specific phases of training, and then you want to know how many weeks is it going to take to train for this marathon, or how many weeks is the marathon build, like when is the marathon phase. And I just don't like the question, because I just don't think that way. Like, yes, if you actually
I don't know.
Nobody does, right? Yeah.
But it's funny because if you attend like a certification, like USATF certification or any of these bigger ones, like that's exactly, they build it out like that. Like here's micro phase 1, micro phase 2, micro 3 that you build into your larger macro phases that build into your full year plan. So I think, and I'd be curious, to talk to other coaches, maybe coaches that are maybe more of a scientific mindset or mind frame, and maybe they view things differently than we do, because maybe they are way more specific with those things. But I think the traditional coaching infrastructure is to really plan things out on like a week by week basis of what phase of training you're in.
I think that's mostly to sell books. I don't, I've just never, I mean, I've met, we all know a million pro runners, and like, I've never met anyone who said that. No, we're in the general phase, right? Like that's just not how we talk, think, or like you may be doing things of that nature, but it's all like so there's not rigid lines where like,
Yeah.
oh, next week I start the general prep phase. So
yeah, it's really easy to confuse like hyper structure and just making it so specific and like using big words and like, making it seem more important, like that things just like, hey, like we open a new door here and we enter, we're a different person, we do something different, then we go in, we open the next door and we turn into a different person. I think it's really easy to confuse that with, this is how you do it. We know everything. Like, and that's,
it's like
I get
VO2 max, like this is a VO2 workout. And it's like, what does that mean? Do you think tomorrow, if we test you, your VO2 is higher? Like, well, technically it's going to be lower, like tomorrow.
Yeah.
But it's just like, and what workouts do you think don't affect VO2 max? Like easy
Well,
running.
how about the workouts that affect VO2 max the most are actually further away from VO2 max?
Yeah.
The best way to improve your VO2 max is to run more, to just do more easy running. It's like for most people, obviously at the level at which we're at right now, like we're probably not going to benefit. Our VO2 max isn't going to get better by running 120 miles a week. But for most people, you go from 25 to 30, to 40 to 50, like your VO2 max is going to climb with it because you're fitter, you're in better shape. Your body has become more efficient versus going and running whatever the internet recommends, 5 by 3 minutes at as fast as you can. And then you're superhuman the next day.
Peter Attia in his last book, like wrote this big thing on VO2 max. And he even wrote like a specific VO2 max workout that will improve your VO2 max. It's just like
Outlive that one.
If that was his last book. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's just like, it's so hard to be like to a regular person, like, but if you jog for 8 minutes, your VO2 max will go up. Like
there's a whole thing going around on Twitter, was it like the 20-second sprints for increasing VO2 max? There's a whole big trend about this, and there's a conversation surrounding it. It's taking a complex concept, or relatively distilling it to one thing. And it's a social media coaching, it's Twitter coaching at the best. And it's,
let me like sideswipe into my training philosophy, because or like my background, because I think that's the way I think about coaching. Like for a general person, you can do anything. Like, like if we do anything, you will improve. If we get a person who's a 4-hour marathon, who's running 8 miles a week, you do any program out there, you will get faster. Doesn't matter. If you run 5 days a week, you'll get better. But I think as coaches, we have a responsibility to think about their efficiency. Like, if you're with me for 10 months, how can I give you the best program for those 10 months? Not just because anything will work. How can I, and then thinking about safety, like, yes, if you could run 100 miles a week, that would be the best thing. But can we do that without you getting hurt? Or what's the risk of that, And I think a big part of how I coach people is thinking about that. Like, how do I keep that in mind? Not just, I see that so much with pros too. It's like so many people do the hardest workout that they can do, and it's like, just because you can run 10 by 458, should you? What is the fitness benefit of that? What's the risk? And then what's our time frame? And so I think so much of when I'm writing workouts is that, like, sure, this much threshold will be good, but is that the safest, most effective thing for us to do where we are and who you are and your goals?
Well, that's essentially, I mean, at a very simple level, the Daniels philosophy. It's like doing the least amount of work to get the most benefit. So why do the most amount of work to get the least benefit? Like, what's the minimum you can do to get the most out of it? And I think that's a good lens to look at coaching
for a long
athletes
time too.
For a long time. Consistently. And especially when you're working with athletes like we do, who have time, they may only have 80 minutes a day that they can run or work out. So, having that mindset going into that stuff I think is important. And
it's why we use T-pace. If you're going to run any of these paces, if you do some work at this, more likely than not, you'll get a little fitter for how sore you're going to get or how much damage it's going to cause. Like this, best bang for your buck, some T-pace, threshold pace.
It can be very simple, right? Like training itself, like to improve yourself, to help your athletes, can be very simple. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy for someone to create their own program, right? It's very difficult to do that still, but we don't need to have all the complexities, and to add extra layers of data and types of training and just make it harder just because we can, to get better. And if you think of the body as an experiment, what's gonna help it, adapt, react to a stress, a workout, and get better. Kind of goes back into what you guys are saying, is like the minimum effective dose, but then doing that consistently over time in the simplest way as well. And I think that kind of goes into at least what I try to think of when I'm building out training programs. Is I talked about I'm trying to keep training fun, trying to keep it, not stale, but also not trying to get too far away from the actual goal of things. And it's not hey, I'm not here to teach a fitness class, right? We're not doing a Peloton class. We're not, varying things just because we can vary it. We still need to have a direction for that and make sure that it's well in place, but in a way that's understandable, but very easily applied.
And I think that's a good place to end this conversation. It's keeping things fun. Don't let it get stale. Distilling complex concepts into simple things that our athletes can understand and can benefit from, I think, is a good place to end this initial conversation. Any last words from either of you guys before we sign off here?
I told you we weren't going to talk for 30 minutes.
Yeah, we're up to an hour and 8 minutes. So that's and I think we could have kept going for another hour and 8 minutes pretty easily. So I think we'll have plenty of conversations to have here. Before we get going, I did create an email address for the podcast. It's mindyourmilespod@gmail.com. So if the
Why do we
4
have to have
people,
pod?
because mindyourmiles@gmail.com was taken. Yeah, so mindyourmilespod@gmail.com. So for the 5 people who listen to this podcast to the end, please send in comments and suggestions or things you'd like us to talk about, because I think we're going to need some topics going forward. And what you want to hear is what we want to talk about here on this podcast. So any last words here from either of you guys?
I will apologize in advance, and this is what I've done on previous podcasts that I've been a part or hosted, is that I apologize for being long-winded. It is, I tend to like to hear the way that my voice sounds. So just as this will be something to get used to. So that's all I've got to say.
I apologize for nothing. I'm going to talk twice as long next time.
All right. Well, on behalf of Dylan and Will, thanks so much, everybody, for listening. And we'll see you next time here on the Mind Your Miles podcast.